Thank you, Annie. And I have to beg your forgiveness. I'm moderating this panel, but I'm a bit sick today. So my dear colleague Sarah Goldberg has offered to help me with speaker introductions. We're very excited to have this enforcement and education panel. We have 3 speakers. We've got New York City's Sheriff Anthony Miranda, DOT's Julia Pate-Laidlaw, and from the Volpe Center, Catherine Taylor, senior economist there. And I'm going to hand it over. Oh, and also I'll introduce Annie Gervis from the Mayor's Office of Operations. Hi, Annie, who's going to be our timekeeper and note taker and recording monitor. Really appreciate your help with that. I'm going to hand it over now to Sarah to introduce our speakers. Go ahead, Sarah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
I am joined both on the phone and on the computer, and I was stuck in the other space. Thank you so much, Anna. It's my pleasure to announce our speakers today. First, we have New York City Sheriff Anthony Miranda, who was appointed to the New York City Sheriff's Office in May 2022 after a long career with the New York City Police Department and then the New York City Administration of Children's Services. He's worked in many areas, including, but not limited to, street narcotics enforcement, community policing, patrol service, and agency security operations, and has provided expert guidance on policing issues as a law enforcement consultant. Sheriff Miranda and his team are charged with a wide range of law enforcement responsibilities, including the duty to preserve the peace and serve and enforce mandates and orders. I very much encourage you to read Sheriff Miranda's full biography, and he'll share with us today some of the Office of the City Sheriff's special enforcement operations, specifically ghost car and fraudulent license plate enforcement. Thank you so much, Sheriff Miranda.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and get to talk to everyone. So thank you for that introduction. And he says, I do have a slide presentation. I'm going to share it with you now and put it on the screen. Took me a little while to get past the technical stuff. I have my technical expert here assisting me on the side just to get me through this. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I'm giving you the first slide that's coming in here. It pretty much spoke to the responsibility of the Sheriff's Office. I think under the recent months, it's being newly discovered the responsibilities that the Sheriff's has and the ability to be able to do enforcement in a number of other areas. In addition to the civil enforcement, which we are traditionally focused on, which are the order protections and the ERPOs and the different things like that. But we also have a lot of enforcement into the criminal law as well. And we know that the store inspections and ghost guns and ghost vehicles have become a major part of our current operations. And just I'll go straight to the last one. It says the powers and duties of New York City Sheriffs include enforcement of criminal and civil laws, vehicle and traffic laws, court-ordered mandates, and directives set forth by the city's mayor. Oh, good look here. They don't see it. And then this is one of the major enforcements that we did with Mayor Eric Adams, who joined us, and Chief Royster from the New York City Police Department. We did a joint operation about the ghost vehicles and the fraudulent license plates. And we were able to highlight the plus almost 10, 15, if not more, states that are major suppliers of these temporary license plates coming into New York City. This one is a short video, and you see the 2 vehicles coming into the screen there. These are vehicles with ghost plates. It shows about the increase of the aggressive driving and the violations that are going on. As you see this play out, one car already ran through the red light, and the second vehicle also has temporary license plates on them. And they're going to be flying through. This is the danger that the community is facing currently with the abundance of fraudulent license plates that are being issued and currently on the streets. This endangers not only other drivers, but as well as people walking in the streets and just the community in general. As people could have gotten seriously hurt during this particular video that was taken. Should be clear, this wasn't taken by law enforcement. This was supplied by someone else making a community complaint about the things that they're seeing. Here was another one that, again, temporary license plates. It says illegal ghost vehicles activity peaked in the spring of 2021. During that time period, there was significant correlation between serious crimes committed and the presence of temporary fraudulent plates. You see it on the news. You see the NYPD reporting it on a regular basis, that these vehicles are involved in homicides, burglaries, and vehicular assaults. What you have on your screen now is advertisement that we were able to capture. These are all fraudulent license plates that are being sold, and we see this type of advertisement going up on a regular basis more frequently. We are also trying to target some of these sellers of the license plates and trying to make purchase in the confines of New York City. But again, these are also not only in New York City, the outside as well. But as you can see, regular advertisement, all of this is fraudulent. In May of 2021, the Sheriff's Office spearheaded the city's enforcement of ghost vehicles, unregistered, uninsured, and displayed invalid license plates. Again, this also came hand in hand with the aggressive driving, the egregious conduct that's happening in the street, the property damage, physical injuries, significant financial loss, and fatalities that were happening at that particular time. The analytics collected have shown significant toll and camera violation evasions costing the city and state untold millions of dollars. I think this has been clearly documented in a number of different publications about the loss of revenue that's coming, this city is being denied right now. In 2021, the Sheriff's Office seized 6,000 vehicles for such violations. In 2022, thus far, we're at 12,975 vehicles have been seized, totaling over 19,000 vehicles that were seized or suspended, invalid registration, expires insurance. So our numbers have doubled in terms of what we've been seizing in the streets right now.
Today we're out here for Operation Temporary Tag. This is an effort by the Sheriff's Department to combat the safety issues in our community. As you can see, all the cars that are out here, these are people who've been riding around with temporary tags. It's a public safety issue in all of our communities. It's an important issue for the city of New York. So we're glad to be a part of the growing mission that's going to be taking place to improve the safety and ensure there's accountability for all the vehicles that are on the road right now. Today's operation brought in approximately 50 vehicles from 3 different police precincts. But we have ongoing operations which interact with all the different agencies, law enforcement agencies throughout the city, working to address this issue. Again, it is something that not only impacts the Sheriff's Department, but impacts every law enforcement agency currently. So you'll be seeing more joint operations. We just finished doing one joint operation with the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. We've done several operations with local precincts, and we'll continue to do more operations throughout the city. So what we're telling people is please take care of it before it becomes an issue where the Sheriff's Department has to take action. The operation that we launched this morning is in keeping with what the mayor has spoken about publicly, about the dangers in our community, and it's consistent with the mission of the Commissioner of Finance as well. So we're looking forward to continuing these types of operations to keep our community safe and address the public safety concerns that are out there.
So on any given night, when we're doing these operations, we see between 50 to 100 vehicles on the nightly operations. Should let you know that we do this on a regular basis on a smaller type plan. The deputy sheriffs go out regularly and seize vehicles with temporary plates, depending on which communities they're working in. All 5 boroughs are actively participating in that. But at least twice a week, we go out and do a major operation where we're seizing anywhere between 50 to 100 vehicles. And this current slide that you're seeing is also showing the VTL seizures. October 2020, we were at 700. In October of 2022, we're at 1,900. When we're talking about the fatalities involving vehicles, in 2020, we're at 26. And 2021, we had a peak of 32. And now in 2022, we have 19 involved. And then you're talking about the percentage-wise, we're looking at 11% in 2022. We had a major increase in 2021 at 22%, it doubled. And now we're down to 5% and kind of holding that percentage rate as well with the camera enforcement. Even though the camera enforcement has increased and camera hours have now, I think it's 7 days a week in some locations and 24 hours. And so even with that increase, we're still holding at a 5%, which speaks to the increased collaboration between the agencies and the enforcement efforts that we're currently engaging. And you can read some of the information there. The VTL compliance seizures under the Scofflaw program include improper insurance coverage, vehicle registration, suspension set forth by the New York State DMV due to excess toll violations.
Got about 3 minutes left.
Okay. The next slide shows joint operations where we did in Manhattan. You see with NYPD. The other one was at the tunnels that we're doing with the state troopers, local law enforcement, and the military as well. We're helping out doing those enforcement activities. And this is in a video, and you can see here, we're showing you that things are available online currently at many different locations, ways of people covering their license plates so they're not detected. This was a button inside the car that puts up a shade that covers the plates when they go through tolls or they're speeding, so their vehicle will not be detected. This vehicle was seized by the Sheriff's Department in enforcement activity. Okay. And I'm going to run right through this information. You can read it. Drivers are usually issued a citation for their violations. Sometimes we arrest them when necessary. We always seize the vehicles when we find them in violation as well. And these joint operations are continuing through all 5 boroughs and have been encouraged by just about everybody wants us. Every local precinct has invited us to come out, and every elected official is currently asking for this type of enforcement in their communities. That concludes the presentation from our side, and I'll open it up for any questions that you may have that you want to ask us.
Yes, yes. In fact, I'm gonna do the Q&A for you now because I know you're under some time pressure. So thank you very much for that presentation, and I'll open it up for Q&A, either if you want to unmute yourself or enter a question in the chat. People are feeling shy for initial. I'll dive in with a question from me. You had that table talking that showed the variations year to year of the vehicle seizures, and then you also had fatalities in there. Can you just clarify which kind of fatalities are those? I don't think those are not the citywide fatalities that Julia oriented us to in the beginning. So which fatalities are those?
The fatalities submitted by DOT for the month of October.
Those were the fatalities submitted. I'm getting my side notes here. There's fatalities that were submitted by DOT for the month of October. So those are specific months that we were trying to do comparisons from month to month. We'll also do year to month as well if you want access to that as well. But that was kind of like just showing us the increase that we've had and the decrease that we've had. So we had a peak at one point in 2021 where the fatalities kind of peaked for us that we were aware of, and then it went down again.
Okay, so those were a specific month. Okay. And it was all modes, or was it just motor vehicle or pedestrian or something?
All modes.
Does anyone else have questions for the sheriff?
Yes, I do. Hi, Sheriff.
Hi.
I just have a question about the technologies that you're using in terms of tracking down and making connections to get ghost cars off the road. Are there any types of technologies that aren't currently at your disposal that would be helpful for you in terms of like investigating or tracking down some of these vehicles?
So there's 2 things that we're working on. One is the LPRs that we're still in the process of arming all of our vehicles with it. So we have a limited amount of vehicles that currently have them. I think we're with OMB trying to finalize the capital purchase so that we can put it on every vehicle that we have in our at disposal to us. In addition to that, we're now working with NYPD to cross over some databases so that we can share information. There are some databases that will give us greater access to drivers' information when we stop these vehicles. And we're sharing our information so that we're, again, working in tangent with each other, because when we stop, we also find out if they owe any money in judgments, that kind of thing. So we're able to cross-reference and get any money that's owed to the city. Not all the other agencies currently have that kind of accessibility, so we're kind of working that through so that anybody else that's involved in enforcement, they also get that level of access of information as well. So there are a few specific databases that we can probably share with you that we're currently negotiating with the police department on the how that would be shared. I think we had some MOUs that have to be signed. We know that they had signed some with other outside agencies. They already have some in place. So we're trying to duplicate that so that we have equal access.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? We have time for one more.
I have one question for the sheriff, if that's okay. Anna, hi, Sheriff. It's Eric Richardson from DCAS. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Question on the ghost cars and the temporary plates. When you're stopping and when you're seizing vehicles, obviously, I know you're finding vehicles that have a lot of outstanding violations when it comes to speeding and red lights. Are you also finding that those vehicles are typically those that are involved in other criminal activity, and that when you're seizing them, it's also a great prevention of crime?
So the answer is yes. When we seize these vehicles, again, we have two levels of operations. One where the vehicles are occupied, and then we stop those vehicles, we do checkpoints, and then we're either removing the vehicles and issuing summonses to the individuals. The ones that we do at night when the cars are parked, we're recovering weapons and we're recovering narcotics that are being stored in these vehicles as well. And in fact, some of them have led to ongoing investigations in local precincts that they do follow up because they're wanted in other cases and other investigations that they have ongoing. And we're working collectively with the district attorney's office as well to any outstanding cases and individuals they have in their databases, cases pending. So we're working with each of the district attorneys in the 5 boroughs as well.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn it back over to Sarah to introduce our next speaker, or reintroduce our next speaker, Julia Kite-Laidlaw. Sarah,
thank you all very much.
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. All right, I'm going to do a really brief reintroduction of our dear colleague, Julia Kite-Laidlaw, Director of Safety Policy at the New York City Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Anna. So today what I want to do is share with you some what's essentially data stories based on the tremendous amount of data that we have from running the largest speed camera program in North America, and quite possibly the largest in the world. During the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, we saw a lot of different changes in behavior that were unlike what we were used to. And now with a lot of that kind of in the rearview mirror, we can look into what that data is showing us and perhaps what kind of insights it brings into the situation on our roads. So with that, I want to give, first of all, just an overview of where we are with the program. Right now, we have a grand total of about 2,200 cameras in operation within 750 school speed zones. A school speed zone is a 1/4 mile radius from a school building, and these cameras, as I'm loving to say everywhere I go, are incredibly effective. They reduce speeding by about 70% at the locations during the hours that they're active, and they are now active 24/7 following a successful push to change state law earlier this year. It's really too early to look at the impacts of that 24/7 change, but we can look at some other factors. A lot of them came from questions actually asked by the health department, so I want to thank them for that. What I'm going to do is kind of go through 3 different topics, 3 questions, and kind of see what the data can tell us about that. So we know during the pandemic, we had a reduction of vehicular volume, more opportunities to speed, different places that people were driving away from the Manhattan core and more in the boroughs, and then also anecdotal reports that people were in general behaving badly. We're speeding, we're street racing, often at night, but during times of day we knew as well. So that brings the first question. Did the proportion of people who were truly egregiously speeding increase during the months of the pandemic? And what can the cameras maybe tell us about that? Well, we do know that almost everyone who gets a speed camera violation is going between 11 and 19 miles per hour over the limit. Keep in mind, our cameras don't give you a violation until you're going 11 miles over the limit. So in most cases, a few exceptions, we see people going between 36 and 54. So if you're going 20 miles an hour over or more, that is truly, truly fast, because keep in mind, our cameras are not on highways. These are all on neighborhood streets or arterial roads. So I took the universe of cameras that were issuing at least 5 violations a day. We started with the second half of 2019. The reason we didn't do the full year is because midway through 2019, state law changed so that we were allowed to expand our number of cameras, change their location from a very limited set of criteria to a 1/4 mile radius, change the hours of operation, again, from very limited to 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. So just in order to keep everything apples to apples, we start with the second half of 2019, then the full years 2020, 2021, and then the first half of 2022. So what did we see before the pandemic? What we're looking at here, the y-axis is the count of individual cameras. The x-axis is the percentage of each camera's violations that went to drivers going 21 miles per hour or more over the limit. So for example, what this is showing us is that in 2019, we had 38 unique cameras where less than 1% of violations went to people going 21 miles per hour or more over the limit. Note that we had far fewer cameras then as we did now. We also had several cameras with absolutely 0 incidents of 21 miles per hour or more over the limit speeding, all in that first bin there. So as you can see, the vast majority of cameras, between 1% and 3%, were this truly egregious speeding. What happens as we get into 2020? Actually not a tremendous change, not a substantial change in shape of this histogram, even though our camera numbers grew as we enforced new locations as allowed under the 2019 law change. So you can see the y-axis, the numbers changed, but the general picture didn't. With a couple rare exceptions, we still saw, the vast majority between 1% and 3%. Now, what happened like mid and late pandemic as we get into 2021? Again, same general shape, but now you see this tail of, it turns out to be 7 cameras that had over 6% of violations in the excessive speeding range. And considering how, just a few years earlier, we pretty much had none over 6%, it's enough to make you start to look at these particular locations and want to look at what's happening there. Now, late pandemic, what we see now, if we compare to pre-pandemic, is actually a slightly better situation. We have a larger proportion of cameras that have less than 1% or less truly excessive speeding. We still have 4 cameras forming this tail of the cameras that have over 6%, but that's now in the context of having over 2,000 cameras citywide. And we have nearly 600 that issue 5 or more violations a day on average. So the bottom line is that truly excessive speeding, even during the pandemic, was always a really tiny proportion of our speeding violations. And truth be told, our cameras really aren't meant to target that kind of behavior. Because think about it, if you're the kind of driver who's going 21 miles per hour over the limit on a residential street, you know what you're doing. You're making a choice. It's not, a bad habit of being a little too lead-footed. It's an active antisocial behavior. You don't care about that $50 ticket we issue, and therefore a nudge like that is not going to change your behavior. And that's why we say that speed cameras aren't the only form of enforcement we need. No, it's sometimes not a fashionable viewpoint, but we do believe that our cameras are meant to target these people on the left side who are largely within 11 to 19 miles per hour over the limit, and they're very successful in doing that. So you might be thinking, okay, 21 miles per hour over the limit, that's truly excessive. What happens if we widen our definition a bit? I also just wanted to show that this is kind of the comparison of the proportion of cameras falling into each bin in 2019 versus 2022. So you see we now have greater proportions in that 1% or less, and largely staying the same at the very, very high end. So what happens if we lower the threshold to say 16 or more miles per hour over, to say maybe you don't have to be an absolutely wild antisocial speeder, but still going quite fast? And the story largely remains the same. If you kind of divide all these bins into thirds, we see that the bottom third proportion has increased while the middle and top have decreased. So we're seeing less extreme speeding now than pre-pandemic when you define it this way. And in 2022 now, you can see that more than half of cameras have 12% or less extreme speeding when you consider extreme speeding to be 16 plus mph over. So the next question that we thought of was, these speeders during the pandemic, are they coming from out of town? Are they local people behaving badly, or is the problem coming in from elsewhere? So when we look at individual cameras in individual months, the data that we have gives us the address of the registered owner of the vehicle. We can't be sure that's the driver, but it's a good enough proxy. So if we look at the balance of New York City registered and non-New York City registered plates during the pandemic, what do we see? So this is a great big busy graph. I'll give you a second to get familiar with it. What you see in this cloud, every data point represents one camera in 1 month. I'll call it a camera month. And each borough is color coded. You've got Brooklyn in blue, Manhattan in green, Queens is the purple empty circle, Bronx is red, and Staten Island is the yellow X. So if a camera was already installed by March 2020, and this is data from March through December 2020, then it would have 9 separate points on this graph. So first thing we see is that Staten Island really does look like an island. The vast majority of people triggering the cameras there are New York City registered. We don't know Staten Island specific, but they're from within the city. But the cameras that have the lowest proportion of in-city plate violators, the 30% or lower over here on the y-axis, those are, what you'd expect really. They're at the crossing points, the Lincoln Tunnel on the west side of Manhattan, the Westchester County line, the Nassau County line. But it doesn't follow that the really menacing speeders are from outside the city, because that's over here on the right side of the x-axis. The violation totals at those edge locations where most people are from out of town are relatively low, which you would expect because we would have had fewer people with a need to come in and out of the city necessarily during that time. Where we see excess speeding again over here on the right side, sometimes we would expect a high number of violations if a camera, say, was really new, because we know people have not yet had the chance to change their behavior by getting a ticket there. And those always drop kind of steadily over the next few months. And of course, when the pandemic began, we were still installing new locations. Although our worst cases would have already been addressed by then, because we always unroll our cameras in terms of degree of severity of the problem. So the worst locations already had cameras by the time the pandemic began. So we look at these outlier cases and think, well, were they new? And actually, no, they weren't. This Thompson Avenue location had been in place since January 2019. Seeger was summer 2019, Houston Street 2018. Avenue U, autumn 2019. So the outliers here probably represent, I'm willing to believe they represent drag racing. You only see 1 month, 1 camera month for them, because people realized, oh, we're screwing around right near a camera that's catching us. And then they went elsewhere. So if you're wondering why there's no chart for 2019 here as a comparison, it's because of that law change I told you about. And we just expanded cameras so rapidly that the data would be muddled. So then if we move on to 2021, keep in mind the x-axis here has now just changed massively because we've got these outlier locations that really pop out. So what we're looking at right here is, when you move into 2021 with the city pretty much opening up again, the cloud itself has pretty much the same shape. It's just been squashed a bit by the change in the x-axis. You still see Staten Island with most local speeders. You still see the out-of-towners coming in at the border locations. But these outliers have appeared. I'll get back to them in a second, but there's this interesting cluster here on West Street in Manhattan. We know that the office workers really hadn't come back at this point. So it's likely reduced traffic here, just made it really easy to speed for anyone who was driving. The high offender cameras there, they were newer cameras in this instance. As I mentioned, we expect to see more violations in a new camera location, but I don't think we expected to see them this huge, because we unroll cameras in order where speeding's a problem. We didn't think there'd be this tremendous amount of speeding at a location that wasn't addressed yet. Everywhere left for installation by 2021 did not have a massive speeding problem to begin with, or so we thought. And these locations had the same falling trajectory over the next few months. So we think the pandemic did contribute to the amplitude of this initial spike on the major outer borough arterials like Conduit, Linden Boulevard, and places around Highland Park on the Brooklyn-Queens border. And then finally, kind of following what Sheriff Miranda was mentioning about plates that may be paper or missing completely or unreadable in some ways. Our cameras actually have to reject these because they can't be looked up to trace to an address. And we've seen a growing proportion of speeding camera triggers having to be rejected. In some cases, you have a temporary plate for a good reason, but in many cases, as the sheriff explained, you don't. So we're wondering, do people who are willing to do illegal things with their plate also drive more dangerously? And it is, a fairly cut and dried image that you're seeing here. What we can see is the number of rejections for plate reasons really took off with the pandemic. March 2020, there and the x-axis, the numbers begin climbing. And even when you take into account that our cameras were expanding, it's a shocking increase. And keep in mind, we were installing a lot of cameras from July 2019, but the spike didn't happen until many, many months onward. And while the rejected plates register higher speeds than the vehicles whose violations we were able to stick, at first it looks like, the difference is only 2 miles per hour, and it's been pretty constant. That hasn't really changed over time. Keep in mind, this is only an average. What we may actually have is outliers skewing everything. It could be that the vast majority of these rejections are driving at the same speed, but then you have some that are just out of control completely, and that brings up the average. We don't know that for sure, though, so we'd have to dig a little deeper into the data. But what we can conclude just by looking at this is that, yeah, the people who are doing the wrong thing with their plate are often doing the wrong thing with their accelerator as well.
Julia, you've got about 1 minute left.
So this is just an example of ways in which, you can kind of have fun with the data when you have as much data as we have. And as we now unroll our 24/7 operation, we're hoping that by this time next year, we'll be able to say more about, say, who's speeding overnight versus who's speeding during the day and what locations may be popping and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I believe you're able to stick around. So I think I'm going to hold. Great. I'm going to hold the questions until after Catherine Taylor's presentation. And let's see if we've got Sarah up and running to introduce Catherine to us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hurrah! I called in. So it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Taylor, who is a senior transportation economist at the United States Department of Transportation's Volpe National Transportation Systems Center. Catherine's work at USDOT relates to many policy issues, including freight economics, passenger rail demand, electric vehicles, equity, and safety. She will share with us today some findings from her and her colleagues' recently published research project on enforcement activity and safety outcomes. Thank you, Catherine.
All right, thank you. Can I get a quick check? Are you seeing a version of the slides that's in presentation mode, or are you seeing like the notes and everything?
It's presentation mode. It looks great.
Great, thank you. So yes, I'm an economist at United States Department of Transportation. Might be a little bit of an unusual occupation for this conference, but I just would say the interest in looking at data to answer interesting questions is what brings us all together. So this project that we did with my colleagues at the Volpe Center, we wanted to look at, we performed a literature synthesis. We had ambitions to do a meta-analysis, and I'll get to that in a minute, but we did a literature synthesis of the existing studies that in order to see if we could find a relationship between an incremental change in the level of enforcement activity and the magnitude of any observed safety outcomes. Our project was sponsored by NHTSA and by GHSA. That they came to us with this question, that there is a widespread understanding that enforcement works, but we want to know how much effort do we have to put into an enforcement activity to get what kind of return in terms of safety impacts. We targeted our scope to these 4 behaviors: occupant protection, distracted driving, impaired driving, and speeding. And we did not look at technology types of information of enforcement, which is nice that we are dovetailing into what Julia did not look at in the previous presentation. So like I said, we had ambitions to do a meta-analysis that we would look at the existing literature and identify data points from which we could estimate a dose response curve. And this graphic to the right is what we had in mind. We hope to accomplish that, on the x-axis, we would plot individual study results in terms of the level of enforcement. In this example, we thought it might be officers per mile, and plot that against the observed change in safety outcomes. In this illustration, we thought it might be a change in crashes. And then if we have results from many studies, we can fit a curve to it and look at many different studies in the literature and hopefully fit a curve to find a relationship overall. So we went to the existing literature. We focused on studies that had data relating to 1990 or later. We finished our literature scan in 2018. And we normalized for the size of the community that this enforcement action was taking place, because we found there's a wide variety. There might be statewide efforts, there might be town efforts, so we had to normalize for that. So I'm going to cut to the main takeaways at the beginning here, rather than waiting for the conclusion. But for fellow researchers who are here, here's our takeaways. There were very few studies that reported enough detail on the level of enforcement from an enforcement effort, either how much money was spent or how many officer hours or how many checkpoints. So while we started with a big literature review, there were very few in the end where we could even plot it on the graph, find the value of the x-axis for a study result. Looking at the safety outcome measures, the other axis on the graph, there is a wide variety of safety outcomes. It might be fatalities, it might be fatal crashes, it might be all crashes. For speeding, it might be observed speeds or measured in numbers of miles per hour over the speed limit. Just very many different ways to measure safety outcomes in the literature, so it made it hard to compare them across studies. Another key feature of the existing literature is that most studies looked at these like special enforcement campaigns like Click It or Ticket. They might last a week or two. And we didn't really find many at all that looked at kind of baseline levels of enforcement, your usual enforcement activities. They were focused on these special campaigns. The final point is pretty important, that these existing studies in the literature, they measured safety outcomes during the campaign. So we're talking about 1 or 2 weeks where they measure speeds or crashes. So we really have a gap in our knowledge on any sort of lasting impacts from these special 1 or 2 week campaigns. But I'll get into the details of how we found that. The team at Volpe did an exhaustive literature review, literature search, I should say, with many keywords related to these targeted behaviors, and identified over 15,000 potential studies. But when we did the screening for did they actually report information on the level of effort used in the campaign or the outcome, that number dropped significantly. And you can see in the table here that, for distracted driving, in fact, we only identified 5 studies that even reported the necessary information we need to do our meta analysis. So I'll start and tell you what we did find for those 4 targeted activities. So in occupant protection, we were able to develop one graph. This is why it's coming up first, because we did get to plot a curve for occupant protection. We found that overall high visibility enforcement campaigns were successful, and that they increased seatbelt usage by 3.5 percentage points. So kind of reporting the averages across the studies we looked at, 77.9% was the seatbelt rate usage pre-campaign, and that increased to 81.4% post-campaign. That's kind of averages across the available studies. And as I mentioned, that was like during the campaign. We really don't know what happened, significantly after the campaign. So the graphic on the right relates to our second finding, is that 1 additional checkpoint per 100,000 people per week in HVE occupant protection campaign is expected to increase seatbelt usage by 0.76 percentage points. That is based on 6 studies which reported results from 23 locations of a campaign. So it's a bit of a small sample size, so keep that in mind. So what does that mean? So 100,000 people, I looked up New York State, that is about the population of Albany. So, and in our study, like, on the lower end, the 25th percentile of our studies had about 0.4 checkpoints per 100,000 people. The upper end, the 75th percentile, was 2.4 checkpoints per 100,000 people. So if you shifted from 0.4 to 2.4 checkpoints, based on the literature, we found that you would increase seatbelt usage by 1.5 percentage points. So that is the graphic there on the right. Another finding we found was that occupant protection campaigns are more effective in places with lower seatbelt use, so that the baseline seatbelt use is higher, you get a little less impact from your campaign, which makes sense. You know, like you've already reached your target population, so it's kind of easier to get improvements if you're further away from the optimal. And we'll note that we did not identify, even though we had data to look at it from studies, we didn't find any statistically significant relationship between number of officer hours and any safety outcomes. Now, that could be small sample size, or it could be there is no effect. We really don't know. Now, distracted driving, this was an area where we didn't have many studies at all, but they're plotted here. We did find that, you know, these distracted effort HVE campaigns are effective. They're plotted here. They all resulted in a reduction in handheld phone use. That was the common metric across these studies. But, you know, you might have spent a lot of effort on it. On the right-hand side, that's around 40 hours of 40 hours of dedicated enforcement per 1,000 residents. And, you know, we have the Connecticut result at the bottom, and that resulted in a reduction in 3.5 percentage points. But also the New York result had a similar amount of effort, but it only resulted in a 1 or so percentage point decline in handheld use. And that 1 to 1.5 percentage point decline is basically where those studies lined up. All right, moving on to alcohol impaired driving. This one was particularly difficult because there were so many ways to measure safety related to alcohol impaired driving. Some measured blood alcohol levels, some measured crashes. And so, you know, there were a lot of studies, but they all use different safety outcomes. So it's hard to compare. So we did something pretty simple. We just, you can look at the bottom row of this table. We found 95 study locations where they did something. 57 of them resulted in a reduction in crashes or prohibited behavior, like had the expected outcome, 60%. The remaining 40% either had mixed results or actually observed an increase in the prescribed behavior. So 60% resulted in what you would expect, and just doing like a statistical test of like, what are the chances of that 60-40 split happening randomly is only 2%. So you can think, what would be the odds if I flipped the coin 95 times that I would get 60 heads? That is found to be pretty unlikely to be due to random chance. So we have confidence that these are overall effective, but not a lot of information on the exact reasoning. You know, did an increased level of enforcement achieve better results was not something we were able to determine. All right, on speeding, this one was actually quite difficult just in concept to measure a level of enforcement or amount of enforcement. Lots of the campaigns in the literature were a simple yes or no. There was an element, something was present or there was not on this section of roadway. So we took a little bit of that might be, you know, a patrol car or a variable feedback message, you know, a variable speed message sign. Just, was there something, was there not something? And so these types of efforts are effective. They result in 4 miles per hour decrease in average speed in work zones, but just about 1 mile per hour in non-work zones.
Got about 3 minutes left.
So, like I said earlier, the available literature that we found shows that overall enforcement campaigns do improve safety measures during and shortly after campaigns, but we were largely unsuccessful in identifying a relationship between the level of enforcement and the magnitude of the safety outcomes. And like I said, the reason is there were just a very few studies that reported sufficient information on the level of enforcement that they used in their campaign. And also that it was another challenge was all the diversity of ways to measure safety outcomes made comparing across studies difficult. So for other people who are embarking on such a study to look at the effectiveness of a campaign, we would encourage other researchers to improve consistency of data reporting and to develop and use consistent metrics across studies. We'd really like to see people looking at describing the baseline levels of enforcement prior to a campaign to understand the total amount of enforcement activity that is occurring, and to look at the impacts, longer lasting impacts after the campaign has ended. That seems to be a real gap in our knowledge. And finally, for organizations that sponsor this type of research, it might be a good idea to take an experimental design approach where we kind of randomly select test locations to get a really more clean comparison of before and after a campaign. For our practitioners, what we found was that, yeah, HVE campaigns do work. So, when you're doing a campaign, I think, it makes sense to combine all those elements of the enforcement, the visibility, and the publicity. It does seem to be an effective strategy. And then we encourage practitioners to collect data so that we can all learn from your experience in order to craft better enforcement campaigns in the future. All right, and if you're interested in looking at our paper, it's available on the National Transportation Library, which has a very cool abbreviation. We call it Rosa P, which was named after our civil rights icon, Rosa Parks. So if you are looking for this paper, go to Rosa P. All right.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. It's like the member of parliament told us, sometimes it's not just eye-opening to learn what you know, but also to learn all the things you don't know. And I really appreciate you illuminating that with your talk. Oops, I just noticed we got a message that we're going to get a 2-minute warning to close up our presentation. So let me open it up really quickly for anyone who might have a question for our presenters.
Hi, I was wondering if just any push in New York State to have digital license plates rather than all the technology about license plate readers, rather than, what EasyPass uses to identify people.
Julia, you're on mute.
Thanks, Andrew. Do you mean whether we would switch to like a transponder type device?
Yeah, a chip that, so that instead of the camera having to resolve, what the letters are.
Yeah. Our cameras currently have a really easy time reading the plate itself. It's not a lack of readability that's a problem, but rather deliberate attempts to obstruct or to evade. So I have a feeling that if we switch to a different kind of system, people would still just be evading that type of system.
And if it's out of state, you'd still need both, right?
Yeah, it would have to be a unified system because our system from our vendor can read plates from all 50 states. We know that the sheriff's team uses the automated license plate readers, in which it works really well for them. They just drive up and down the street and the system immediately scans it and goes to the database and tells them, say, if there's an outstanding judgment on one of the plates, and we can communicate with them really easily just through the plate system.
Okay, thanks.
I'll open the floor for any other questions. Don't be shy.
I have a quick ask for Catherine. I'm wondering the relationship between urban and rural or high visibility enforcement, if you did some controls for street corners versus highway checkpoints.
No, that's a great idea. If we had more data, that might be fruitful. I can't remember if it was one of the controls we attempted to. I think our biggest effort at that was trying to normalize for the size of the community that a checkpoint, the effectiveness of a checkpoint likely does, depend on how many people are exposed to the checkpoint, which is smaller and less populous areas.
Thank you, Sarah. Anyone else? While we're chewing on potential questions, something that, came to my mind as you were speaking, Catherine, was that we have a natural experiment opportunity with the pandemic and enforcement. And I hope some of our academic colleagues will reach out to us and we can continue our conversation after this event to come up with ways to better measure what might have been the relationship between dangerous driving or speeding or crashes or any of those outcomes and enforcement levels. So I think that'd be really, really great to write up and to get in the literature.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the work here is done just because the question wasn't answered well in the existing literature. It's a call to do more research, and improve our methods going forward.
Definitely. Well, we are being called out of the breakout rooms. We have a longer break now for you to stretch and grab a bite to eat. So thank you very much again to our speakers, Sheriff Miranda and Julia Kate-Laidlaw and Catherine Taylor. I really appreciate you all being here and sharing the fantastic information, and we'll see you after the break. Thank you.